Chapter 009. Cheaters. Majera, intoned Zorian, finishing the spell with the word he wanted the spell to search for. He felt the spell reach out around him, scanning the books in the surrounding shelves for any mention of the word in question, and poured some more mana into the spell to expand its radius. His efforts to overcharge the spell almost unraveled it, forcing him to spend several seconds stabilizing the spell boundary, but in the end the mana flow snapped into its proper place and the spell finished its task as planned. 7 golden threads flickered into existence, seemingly growing out of his chest and connecting him to various books in this particular section of the library. Zorian smiled. The spell was one of the book divinations Ibri had taught him, one that sought out books containing a specified word or string of words. It was a somewhat fragile spell, failing if the number of positive matches exceeded a certain number, the exact number depending on the caster's skill. It was mostly used to search for quotes or really exotic terms. Exotic terms like, say, the dead language of Majera. Xenomir hadn't been kidding when he had told Zorian that he wouldn't be able to find any books about it. There were no books specifically about the Majera language, and very few books even mentioned it. Up until now, he had only found 13 other books that contained the word, and most of them only in the form of a throwaway comment or two. It was possible that the knowledge he sought existed somewhere in the library, only in a format that was invisible to the divinations he was using. Ibri had only taught him the very basics of library magic, as she called it, so his searches were painfully crude in the grand scheme of things, but if that was the case, there was little he could do about it. He glanced down at the threads growing out of his chest and waved his hand through them, watching it pass through them without effect. He never got tired of doing that. Well, he probably would, in time, but the novelty hadn't worn off yet. The threads were an illusion, existing only in the privacy of his own mind. Every divination spell needed a medium through which it could present information to the caster, since it was impossible for human minds to process the raw output of a divination spell. A self-imposed illusion like the threads he was currently looking at was actually fairly advanced as divination mediums go, or so Ibri had claimed when he had tried to tell her he got the spell working within 30 minutes of being shown how to do it. He had a distinct impression she thought he was lying. He didn't really understand what was supposed to be so difficult about it. To be honest, the threads were a purely mental construct that didn't even require much in the way of shaping skills, just visualization. It seemed pretty simple to him. Natural even. He shook his head and followed after one of the golden threads till he reached a book it was attached to. It was a huge, intimidating, 400-page book about the history of Mycena, and Zorian had absolutely no intention of poring over it until he reached the tiny part that actually interested him, so he cast another divination Ibri had taught him. This one highlighted every mention of the chosen word, in this case Majera, in shining green, so he simply flipped through the book till he caught a flash of green. Zorian? What are you doing here? Zorian immediately snapped the book shut and stuffed it back on the shelf. While he wasn't doing anything forbidden, he really didn't want to explain to Ibri what Majera was, and why he was searching the library for any mention of it. The retort he planned to use died on his lips when he finally turned to get a good look on his visitor. Ibri was a mess. Her eyes and nose were red, as if she had been crying recently, and there was an ugly purple splotch covering her right cheek and neck. It didn't look like a bruise, not exactly, more like... Oh hell no. Ibri, he started hesitantly. You wouldn't happen to go in the same class as my brother, would you? She flinched back and looked away. He sighed heavily. Just great. How did you know? She asked after a second of silence. Brother Dearest came to me earlier today, said Zorian. Said he pushed a girl into a purple creeper patch and wanted me to make an anti-rash potion. I wasn't in the mood so I kind of blew him off. That was a lie, actually. He had discovered, during the last 3 reverts, that Fortov was either unable or unwilling to track him down if he failed to return to his room after class. That was actually the main reason why he spent the entire day in the library instead of inside his room. Still, due to his rather unique situation, he knew what would have happened had he been present. "Oh," she said quietly. That's all right." "No," disagreed Zorian. "No, it's not. If I had known he was talking about you, I would have helped him out." "Well, helped you out? He can go die in a fire as far as I'm concerned." He paused for a moment, considering things. "You know, there is no reason why I can't do it now. I'll just have to stop by my room to pick up the ingredients and dash." "You don't have to do that," Ivory quickly interrupted. "It's not that important." Zorian took in her appearance one more time. Yup, she had definitely been crying before coming here. Besides, her choice of words was conspicuous. She said that he didn't have to do it, not that he shouldn't, and that it wasn't that important, not that it wasn't. "It's not really a problem," he assured her. "The main reason I refused in the first place is because it was Fortov who asked, not because it was so difficult to do. Just tell me where to find you when I'm done." "I'd like to come with you, if it's not a problem," she said hesitantly. "I'd like to see how the cure is made. Just in case." Zorian paused. That was potentially problematic. After all, the alchemical workshop would be closed down this late in the evening, and he would have to employ some unorthodox methods of gaining access. But what the hell, it wasn't like she would remember this in the next restart. Thus they set off towards Zorian's apartment. Of course, having Ivory looking over his shoulder wasn't enough, so when he had finally reached his room he found another familiar person waiting for him. Specifically, Zack. He wasn't terribly surprised to see Zack waiting for him, to be honest. The boy had been getting steadily more nervous during their practice sessions as the summer festival approached, no doubt unnerved by the impending invasion. Not that he ever told Zorian about the invasion, Zack was stubbornly tight-lipped about that, regardless of how much Zorian tried to goad him into blurting out something. Over the last few days, his fellow time traveler had questioned him about his plans for the summer festival several times, not so subtly implying that staying inside his room would be a bad idea. As Zorian still remembered quite vividly how one of the flares flattened his entire apartment building when the invasion started, he was inclined to agree with Zack on that one. Unfortunately, Zack seemed to have trouble believing that Zorian was in agreement with him on that point. No doubt he came specifically to make sure, again, that Zorian was going to attend the dance. Zorian wondered, for God knows what time, just what happened between Zack and his previous incarnations to produce this kind of impression. Had he really been that stubborn before the time loop? He walked up to Zack, who was sitting on the floor next to his door, completely oblivious to his surroundings while he concentrated on something on his palm. No, now that he got closer he could see it was actually something above his palm. A pencil, lazily spinning in the air above Zack's palm. Apparently Zack knew the pen spinning exercise too, and was currently practicing it while he waited. Zorian had a strong urge to throw a marble at Zack's forehead and demand that he starts over, but decided against it. Mostly because he didn't have any marbles on his person at the moment. "Hello Zack," Zorian said, startling Zack out of his reverie. "Are you waiting for me?"
"Yeah,"
confirmed Zack. He opened his mouth to say something else but then noticed Ivory trailing behind Zorian and snapped his mouth shut. Am I interrupting something?" "No, not really," Zorian sighed. "I just came to grab some alchemical supplies and then I'll go make something for Miss Ambercombe here." "What did you want with me?" It can wait a while," Zack said dismissively. "What are you making?" "Maybe I can help, I'm pretty good at alchemy." "Is there anything you're not good at?" asked Zorian with a snort. "You'd be surprised," mumbled Zack. Ivory watched their interaction in silence, but Zack was a fairly sociable person, so by the time Zorian returned from his room with a box of supplies, the two of them were engaged in lively conversation. Mostly about Ivory's current condition. "Man, I didn't know your brother is such a jerk, Zorian," Zack remarked. "No wonder you turned out to be such a..." He trailed off when Zorian raised his eyebrow at him, daring him to finish that sentence. Ivory's reaction was more vocal. "He's not a jerk," she protested. "He didn't mean for this to happen." "He should have fixed it, though," Zack insisted. "Intentionally or not, it was his fault. He shouldn't have dumped his responsibility on his little brother like this." "Nobody forced Zorian to do anything," Ivory said. "He's doing this out of his own free will." "Right, Zorian?" "Right," agreed Zorian. "I'm doing this because I want to." He actually agreed with Zack, but chose not to say so. If he had learned anything about Ivory from spending an entire revert around her, it was that she had a massive crush on Fortov. No good could come from bad-mouthing him in front of her. Besides, if he was to be honest with himself, Zorian had to admit he was incapable of being objective about Fortov. There was too much bad blood between the two of them. Thankfully, the two of them quickly agreed to disagree on the topic, and a comfortable silence descended on the group. Well, it was comfortable for Zorian. Apparently Zack didn't agree. "Hey, Zorian," Zack said. "Why are we going towards the academy proper?" "So I can access the alchemical workshop, of course," said Zorian. He knew what Zack was getting at, of course, but he was still hoping to get away without revealing one of his most closely guarded tricks. "No such luck." "But all the workshops are closed this late in the evening," remarked Zack. "Ah!" Ivory exclaimed. "He's right. They closed down 2 hours ago." "It won't be a problem," Zorian assured them. "So long as we clean up after ourselves, no one will know we were there." "But the door is locked," pointed out Zack. Zorian sighed. "Not to magic, it isn't." "You know unlocking spells?" asked Zack in a surprised tone. Zorian understood his surprise. Unlocking spells were restricted magic, due to their obvious abuse potential. Unless you possessed a special license, even knowing how to cast them was a crime. Not a particularly serious crime, but a crime nonetheless. Perhaps it was good, then, that Zorian didn't know a single unlocking spell. "No, I don't," said Zorian. "But it's just a simple mechanical lock. I'll just manipulate the tumblers telekinetically." "Piece of cake." They gave him a blank look. Like most people, they had no idea how locks actually worked, and how easy it was to bypass most of them. Zorian, due to his somewhat colorful childhood, did. In fact, he could pick your average lock without using magic at all. It was just a lot slower than his little magic trick and required him to carry around a set of lockpicks. He stopped in front of the door leading into the alchemical workshop and tried the handle. Like Zack said, it was locked. Shrugging, Zorian placed his palm over the keyhole and closed his eyes. He could feel Zack and Ivory cluster around him to get a better look at what he was doing, and did his best to block them out. He needed total concentration for this. He had developed this particular trick back in his second year, after he got bored of refining the standard shaping exercises they were given. It involved flooding the locking mechanism with his mana, using the resulting mana field as a sort of touch sight to get a feel for the lock, and then carefully moving the tumblers into proper position so he could neutralize the lock. It took him months of stubborn practice, but by now he was good enough at it to unlock most doors in 30 seconds or less. Even warded ones. He didn't say this to Zack and Ivory, but the door he was trying to open was actually warded. Anything even remotely important in the academy was, including most of the doors. However, as Zorian quickly discovered when he experimented with the newly developed skill, low-level wards were very specific. they countered a handful of common unlocking spells, and nothing else. Zorian's little trick was not a structured spell, and thus didn't trip these rudimentary wards at all. The door clicked and Zorian tried the door handle again. This time the door opened without resistance. "Wow," said Zack as they all filed into the workshop. "You can open a lock just by pressing your hand against it for a few seconds." Zorian gave him a sour look. "It's a lot more complicated than that, that's just the visible part." "Oh, I don't doubt that for a second," Zack said. Still, while Zack seemed very impressed with Zorian's achievement, Ivory remained strangely quiet and kept giving him funny looks. This was why he hated telling people about his lockpicking prowess, most immediately assumed he was some kind of a thief. Well, that and he didn't want the Academy authorities to find out about his achievement. They would no doubt change their warding scheme and then he wouldn't be able to do what he just did. Fortunately, Ivory wasn't as condemning as some people Zorian met in his life, and got over her suspicions quickly once he started to prepare the salve. Strangely enough, Zack didn't know how to make one, even though it was a fairly simple thing to make and Zack had demonstrated some mightily impressive alchemical work in class. He didn't appear all that interested in learning, either. Apparently the anti-rash salve was too mundane for his tastes, and he was only interested in things like strength potions and wound-closing elixirs. That sounded like trying to build a house without bothering to set up proper foundations, but it wasn't Zorian who was a decade-old time traveler. Yet. "Aren't those purple creeper leaves?" Ivory asked, pointing at the small pile Zorian had placed on a wet piece of cloth. "Yes," confirmed Zorian, wrapping the leaves into the cloth. "They're the main ingredient, though they have to be crushed first. Alchemical manuals usually claim you have to reduce the leaves into powder, but it's not really necessary to go that far. You just have to use more leaves otherwise, but it's not like purple creepers are in short supply." An hour later, the salve was done and Zack was kind enough to conjure some kind of illusionary mirror so Ivory could apply the salve on herself right then and there. Kind and sneaky, because while Ivory was busy with applying the salve on herself, Zack dragged Zorian away in the corner so he could talk to him in private. "So?" Zorian prompted. "What is it?" Zack reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring, which he promptly handed to Zorian. It was a featureless band of gold that reacted strangely when Zorian channeled some mana into it. "It's a spell formula," Zack said. "Magic missile," guessed Zorian. "That, plus shield and flamethrower," Zack said. "Now you can use all three in actual combat." Zorian looked at the ring with newfound respect. There was only so much one could cram into a spell formula, and it was mostly dependent on the size of the item used as a base. Turning something as small as a ring into a spell formula for 3 different spells was a pretty impressive feat, even if they were relatively low-level ones. "Must have been pretty expensive," Zorian remarked. "Made it myself, actually," Zack said with a grin. "Still, that's a pretty valuable thing to give away to someone you've met less than a month ago," said Zorian. "Why do I get the feeling I'll be needing this in the near future?" Zack's smile disappeared and he suddenly became more subdued. "Maybe. I'm just making sure, you know. You never know when an angry troll might get a jump on you or something." "How oddly specific," noted Zorian. "You know, you've been getting steadily more nervous as the summer festival approaches. And you seem oddly interested in making sure I attend the dance. You will, right?" Zack prompted. Yes, I told you I will half a dozen times already," huffed Zorian. "What's so important about the dance, anyway? What's going to happen there, oh great traveler from the future?" "You have to see it to believe it," Zack sighed. "It's possibly even more implausible than time travel being real." "That bad?" asked Zorian, privately agreeing that an invasion of that scale was something he would have had trouble believing in if he had not lived through it. "Just try to survive, okay?" Zack sighed. Before Zorian could say anything else, Zack suddenly donned a mask of fake cheerfulness and spoke in a voice loud enough to be heard by Ivory. Wow, Zorian, I'm sure glad we've had this talk, but I should really get going now. Have to be well rested for tomorrow.
Bye.
Zorian.
Bye.
Ivory. I'll see you both at the dance. And then he left. Zorian shook his head at the other boy's exit and walked up to Ivory, who was now free of purple rash that once covered her face and neck. Well, I guess we should go too, Zorian said. The academy normally doesn't have anyone patrolling after dark, but that idiot's shouting may have alerted someone to our presence. Oh. Right. Zorian watched Ivory as they filed out of the workshop, and he used his magic trick to relock the door again. She seemed strangely subdued for someone who got what they wanted. What's wrong? He finally asked after a while. Nothing's wrong, she said. Why do you ask? You don't seem very happy to be cured, he noted. I am, she protested. It's just. Yes, he prompted. I don't have anyone to go to the dance with, she said. The boy I was hoping to go with already has someone by now. If her unnamed boy was Fortov, probably, considering her obvious crush on him, then yes, he most certainly did. In fact, he probably had 1 week in advance, so there was never much chance of her going with him in the first place, but he didn't feel the need to crush her dreams like that. Then you'll just have to do the same thing I will and go to the dance all by yourself, won't you? Concluded Zorian. She suddenly stopped and gave him an appraising glance. You don't have anyone to go with either, she asked. Zorian closed his eyes and swore in his head. He really walked into this one, didn't he? Break. Zorian was nervous. Ever since his very first restart, he had been studiously avoiding the city on the day of the festival, not willing to get caught up in the invasion again. Being present within city limits could easily result in his grisly death, after all, and back then he wasn't sure whether his current restart would be his last. That wasn't an option anymore, unless he wanted to clue in Zack that there was something wrong with him, he didn't. Bottom line was, he was stuck attending the dance, with the unexpected addition of Ivory as his date for the evening. He wasn't exactly happy with that, actually. He didn't really have much of a plan for the evening, except to wait and see what would happen, but Ivory's presence at his side would no doubt limit him. Not to mention that he still remembered his disastrous evening with Akoja, and had very little desire to live through a repeat performance, consequences erasing time loop or not. Speaking of his evening with Akoja, Zorian had to admit one thing about Ivory: she was a lot more reasonable and considerate than Akoja was. She didn't drag him out of his room 2 hours before the event, or make him wait smack in the middle of the huge throng of people gathered at the entrance, or drag him off to chat with a bunch of people who only cared about him being Damon's and Fortov's brother. She was also more interested in scanning the crowd for any trace of Fortov than paying attention to him, but that was okay. He was under no illusion that she had asked him out because she was actually interested in him. After a while he decided to have mercy on her and informed her that Fortov was already inside, preparing for tonight's performance along with the other members of the Academy Music Club. Naturally, Zack's entrance was in the boys' usual flamboyant style. He had caught everyone's attention when he had shown up with not 1, but 2 dates for the evening. Zorian didn't recognize either girl, and then further wooed people by demonstrating some very impressive and attention-grabbing dancing. Apparently Zack had learned more than magic during these restarts. Zorian clapped with the others when Zack finally finished showing off, and considered the merits of sinking some time into a non-magical skill. Not dancing, though. Or any other high society skill, for that matter. Honing those beyond the elementary level he had already grasped would require him to construct a mask so thorough he wasn't sure he'd be able to take it off afterwards. The benefits weren't worth selling his soul over, even metaphorically. This is a lot fancier than I thought it would be, Ivory noted, fingering the lacy tablecloth in front of her. It's obviously more than just a school dance, agreed Zorian. I'm guessing the academy was organizing some kind of event for foreign dignitaries this year and then decided to simply merge it with the school dance for whatever reason. I guess, Ivory said. They did invest a lot into making everything look good this year, and I doubt they did it for our sake. Ivory looked at the far end of the table, where Zack was entertaining a small crowd around him, his two escorts nowhere to be seen. After a few seconds of this observation, she turned to Zorian and stared at him strangely. What? Zorian said, a little unnerved by her stare. I've been meaning to ask you, she began hesitantly. What is it between you and Zack? I mean, I know you're friends with him, but how did that come about? You seem very different from one another. It's a recent thing, said Zorian. And it was mostly Zack's doing, to be honest. All I did was escort him home after he got sick in class one day, and he decided we were best friends after that. I sort of went along with the flow. So you don't know about… His sudden growth in skill, guessed Zorian. He was actually surprised she hadn't questioned him about that sooner. Almost everyone else did. Of course, she would get the same shameless lie that he fed to everyone who questioned him about it. I have no idea how that happened, but I can tell you it's real and not some kind of a trick like many people have been suggesting. He has been tutoring me in combat magic for a while now, and he really knows his stuff.
Yeah.
I heard you were doing that, Ivory said, causing Zorian to frown. Being associated with Zack had made people disturbingly interested in his activities, no matter how mundane or irrelevant they may be. Having people scrutinize his every action like they had been doing for this past month was a novel experience. Novel and unwelcome. Kieran has been kind of impressed with your growth, you know?
Yeah.
At least until he found out that Zack was involved, at which point it simply became one more thing that made Zack such a mystery, rather than a product of Zorian's own talent. Obviously Zack had some kind of secret teaching technique on top of everything else. Obviously. But it's not like he was still bitter or anything. Impressed, right? Said Zorian sourly. So what do you think is behind Zack's amazingness? Well, it's kind of silly, Ivory said. Zorian gestured for her to go on. He always loved to hear the explanation people thought up to explain the mystery that was Zack. Much of the speculation wasn't serious, so much as attempts to think up the most imaginative, or the funniest, solution to the problem, so he doubted Ivory's explanation was any sillier than some of the stuff he had been hearing all month long. His personal favorite was that Zack performed an ancient ritual where you eat another person's brain in order to get their knowledge. Time dilation, Ivory said after a brief moment of hesitation. Zorian blinked. Oh, Ivory. So close, and yet so far away. I don't think any hasting spell is that effective, to be honest, said Zorian. Zack isn't just a little better than he was, I'd personally put him around third circle at least. I actually don't think he has any reason to attend the classes anymore, except that he finds it amusing to do so and flaunt his knowledge to everybody. I kind of noticed that, Ivory said, glancing momentarily to the small group of people surrounding Zack. But I wasn't thinking of hasting magic. Do you know what the Black Rooms are? Zorian shook his head in negative. There are rumors that powerful nations like ours have special training facilities that use extreme levels of time dilation. You go inside the facility, spend a couple of months, or even years inside, and when you get out only a day or two have passed outside. Zorian's eyebrows rose at the description. If one of the major powers had something like that, why weren't the effects more keenly felt? None of the successor states were shy about using their power, and would have surely used such a tool to churn out trained mages on a mass scale by now. It's just a rumor, Ivory quickly added. Something between a conspiracy theory and an urban legend. I only know about it because one of my friends loves those kinds of things and she keeps insisting there is one such facility in the tunnels beneath the city. Supposedly they consume massive amounts of mana, so they must be located at mana wells. And the hole is the biggest mana well there is, Zorian noted. What's the explanation for such secrecy surrounding them? You'd think they'd be using it pretty intensively. They can't, Ivory said. Or at least that's how the story goes. They have some kind of severe limitations on their use. Exactly how countries pick who gets to use the black rooms is where the conspiracy theory part comes in. The more conventional theories suggest they're simply fancy facilities for training Black Ops super agents. The wilder ones are, well, wild. It's a neat theory, Zorian hummed speculatively. Far closer to reality than anything else he'd heard, though he'd never say that aloud, even as a joke. If she could take such a far-fetched rumor seriously, there was a good chance she might actually believe him upon hearing the truth, and that would be very awkward at the moment. Maybe he should try to convince her in one of the next restarts. Something to think about, at least. But if Zack had spent years in one of those black rooms, why hasn't he visibly aged? And why exactly would they let Zack use one of those? Well, he didn't have to literally spend years, Ivory said. It's not that anything he's done is that advanced. A couple of months of intense tutoring could probably produce the effects we're looking at. And even if he spent years, there are potions that can halt your aging for a year or two. They actually work better on young people. Zorian resisted the urge to frown as he realized something. As much as Zack liked to show off, he never really went wild with his abilities for all to see. If Zack had showed the sort of magic he did during the invasion, neither Ivory nor anyone else would be dismissing Zack's prowess as not advanced so easily. Then again, perhaps that was the whole point. Extremely skilled Zack was surprising, maybe even shocking to those who knew him before the change. Instant Archmage Zack would be probably alarming in the extreme and inspire a matching attitude in people around him. Perhaps Zack's behavior was a lot more calculated than he thought it was? As for why him? Ivory continued. Well, he's a Novita. They were quite influential before their eventual fall, and I don't just mean in the sense of being rich. They had their fingers everywhere. I could easily see some of that old influence surviving to this very day. Zack is the last of his line, and the fate of his house rests upon his shoulders. Perhaps this was simply a desperate maneuver by Zack's guardians, trying to turn Zack into a worthy successor capable of returning Novita to their former glory. The ground shook, followed by a deafening explosion less than a second later. Windows rattled, but didn't break. An uneasy silence descended upon the dance hall, only broken by the periodic rumble of more distant explosions. What was that? Ivory asked fearfully. She wasn't the only one asking that kind of questions. Agitated murmurs started traveling through the gathered crowd, steadily growing in volume and alarm. The ever-present pressure Zorian always felt from being inside crowds intensified and changed. What was usually just an annoyance pushing on the edges of his consciousness suddenly became a suffocating blanket of fear. He struggled not to faint as foreign feelings invaded his mind. What the hell was happening to him? He didn't remember anything about an attack like this from his previous experience of the invasion. A minute ticked away. Then 10. Zorian could practically feel the anxiety and agitation of the crowd steadily rising. The last, and first, time he had lived through the invasion he was standing on the roof when that first barrage descended to Earth, and was momentarily incapacitated as a result. At least, that's what he had thought. Apparently he had been knocked out for quite a bit longer than he realized, because by his reckoning Ilsa and Kieran should have been rushing to the roof to see what was happening by now. He could see them arguing about something in a nearby corner, and neither made the slightest move towards the roof. Zorian? Ivory tried for either the 5th or 6th time, Zorian wasn't sure. Are you sure you're all right? Maybe I should go find someone. I'm fine, Zorian said, somehow managing to shove the oppressive feelings aside for the moment. The explosions had finally stopped, but that hadn't led to people calming down. If anything, now that the situation had calmed down somewhat, they wanted answers, and they wanted them now. They were getting restless. Thankfully, the academy staff seemed to realize this as well. Look, Ilsa is trying to say something. Please remain calm. Ilsa said from the music stage, using the same magic that carried music evenly across the dance hall to make herself heard by everyone present. Me and my colleague will go to the roof now and open communications with the city authorities to find out what is going on. Please don't go anywhere until we return. Well, that didn't do much to calm people down. If anything, they got even more unruly than they were before Ilsa's speech, and some outright ignored her warnings and left the dance hall the moment she went up the stairs and out of sight. He couldn't judge them too harshly, since in another timeline he had done the exact same thing. On the positive side, the oppressive feeling lifted and reverted back to the familiar headache-inducing pressure. He breathed a giant sigh of relief. Hello, Zorian, greeted Zack, approaching Zorian. Of course he'd come to talk to him now. Quite a commotion, huh? And I see you talked Miss Ambercombe into being your date for the evening. Congratulations. I never knew you liked older girls. I'm only a year older than him, Ivory protested. She glanced briefly at Zorian to see if he would point out that it was her who asked him out, and relaxed when she realized he wouldn't. Zorian had to restrain himself from rolling his eyes. And how come you're here all by yourself? Why don't you introduce us to your dates? If Ivory thought to fluster Zack by pointing out the plural nature of his partners for the evening, she was going to be sorely disappointed. And indeed, Zack only smiled at her, completely unaffected by the jab. They decided to leave for home early, Zack shrugged. Probably for the best, considering what happened. What did happen, though? Asked Zorian. He didn't expect to get a straight answer out of Zack, of course, but it was worth a try. I guess we'll find out soon, said Zack, pointing to the bottom of the stairs leading to the roof, where Ilsa was talking to a bunch of students. After a couple of seconds, Zorian realized that Akoja was among them, and recognized several other faces as well. Who is she talking to? Asked Ivory. Class representatives, I think, Zorian said. At least, the ones I recognize are all class representatives for their groups. It was so frustratingly slow. Maybe Zorian was expecting a little too much from a mere educational institution, but their response to the invasion was pretty underwhelming. At the very least he had expected them to start evacuating people to the shelters by now, or organize some kind of a defense force, or, well, anything, really. He was getting an impression that Ilsa and Kieran didn't even realize the severity of the situation yet. Finally, Ilsa seemed to finish with her instructions and the crowd of class representatives dispersed into the crowd. It only took Zorian a minute to realize what they were doing. Each one was gathering their own classmates into a single group. He bid Ivory
Goodbye.
and left towards his own group together with Zack. Once everyone was present, Akoja told them what the plan was. The academy was going to use their limited teleportation capabilities to get foreign dignitaries and other important people out of the city, and the students were going to descend into the tunnels beneath the city to reach the shelters on foot, with no teachers present to guide and defend them, because they had other duties currently and class representatives had to know the evacuation routes to get the job anyway. Zorian looked at Zack to gauge his reaction and saw that the boy's expression was grim and focused. All right, Zack mumbled. Show time. Zorian had a bad feeling about this. Break. Surprisingly, it wasn't Zack who raised the alarm, it was Rainy, of all people. How exactly she detected the winter wolves 5 minutes before they showed up he had no idea, but notice them she did, and she immediately raised the alarm. A lot of students didn't believe her, but most weren't willing to risk it. The entire procession of students started to move faster towards the small cylindrical building that marked the staircase leading down into the shelters. They never made it there before the winter wolves reached them. Zorian wasn't a soldier, and would never call himself an expert on tactics, but what the throng of students did upon sighting the horde of winter wolves coming after them still struck him as monumentally stupid. They scattered. The ones closest to the dungeon entrance rushed towards it, but the others immediately sought the closest shelter. He could hear Zack's frantic shouting, telling people not to separate from the main group, but it was in vain. Cursing, Zorian snatched Akoja by the wrist before she could bolt towards the nearby apartment building and wordlessly pointed towards the dungeon entrance. For a moment he thought about explaining his reasoning in more detail, but he knew he didn't have enough time for that. He let go of her and started running, hoping she would have the presence of mind to follow. Thankfully, she did follow him, as did several other students that witnessed the silent exchange and realized the importance of it. As they ran, more people joined them, seeking safety in numbers. Around him, chaos reigned. The winter wolves were pouring in by the hundreds, and unlike the fleeing students, they were frighteningly well coordinated. Small groups of 3 to 4 wolves detached themselves periodically from the main body to intercept lone targets before rejoining the horde, using their superior numbers to flank and outmaneuver their opponents. Their white fur and the surprising silence with which they moved made them seem like an army of ghosts risen from the underworld to punish the living. Screams. Shouting. Flashes of light and canine howls of pain too. Not every student was helpless. Up ahead, Zack was defending the entrance to the tunnels viciously, sending swarm after swarm of force projectiles that hit far harder than your run-of-the-mill magic missile, felling scores of winter wolves with each volley. A number of people reached the safety of a nearby building and promptly barricaded themselves inside, ignoring the pleas of those outside to let them in. Just as Zorian thought they would make it to the entrance without incident, his luck ran out. A large group of 30 or so winter wolves noticed them and moved to intercept. The group halted immediately, unsure what to do as the pack continued to get closer. They had to go through it to reach the shelters, but fighting the wolves was suicide. Zack was busy incinerating a group of war trolls that finally made their appearance and wouldn't be able to help for a while. "I told you I should have brought my sword," one of the boys groused. "But..."
No!
"It's not suitable for a school dance," you said. "You're too paranoid for your own good," you said. "Oh, shut up," a female voice snapped back. Zorian resisted the urge to fire off a couple of missiles at the approaching winter wolves. Even shaped as piercers, they weren't guaranteed to kill in one shot something as resilient as a winter wolf, and he still tended to fail quite often when he tried to weave a homing function in them, so there was no guarantee he would even hit anything. He had to use his mana intelligently. Not everyone thought so, however. A number of people had a spell formula hidden on them in the form of a ring or a necklace, much like he did, and they threw missile after magic missile into the advancing wolves. Only one girl was capable of casting a proper homing bolt, so most of them missed, and when they did hit they were just smashers, so they didn't kill any of them. They did, however, slow the pack down and force it to cluster together, since the girl that could fire homing bolts targeted any wolf that tried to detach from the pack to flank them. And that gave him an idea. The moment the pack got close enough, Zorian fired an overpowered flamethrower straight into their front lines. Clustered together as they were, most of them were caught in the blast. The winter wolves, notoriously weak to fire, howled in fear and agony. That's when someone else fired another flamethrower into their ranks, this one much bigger and hotter than Zorian's, and the winter wolves promptly turned and fled. The ones that still lived, that is. Zorian turned to see who cast the other flamethrower and was surprised to see Brian there, staring smugly at the charred corpses in front of him. He was holding his fire drake in his arms like a living weapon, and the little lizard was licking its chops like it wanted to eat its kills. So much for his theory that the drake was too young to breathe fire. After a moment of shock at the sudden reversal, they all scrambled into the building housing the dungeon entrance and immediately descended into the tunnels below. Zorian was immediately intercepted by a worried Ivory, who seemed extremely relieved that he was alive. Even though he knew her death wouldn't be permanent, he had to admit he was glad she survived as well. Though, now that he could sit down and think about it a little, it wasn't that unusual she had survived. She was a fourth-year student, and they were at the front of the procession for some reason. That was very unfortunate, because fourth-year students were, presumably, much more capable of defending themselves than third-year ones, and they were the ones who reached the safety of the shelters first, leaving their younger compatriots to fend for themselves. "I didn't know you had any fire spells," Briam noted from his left, stroking his familiar affectionately. "I guess that's one of the things Zack has been teaching you this past month, huh?"
Yeah,
Zorian admitted. He gave the fire lizard a dubious look, and the reptile stared back at him challengingly. "Did you really bring your familiar to the school dance?" "Oh, no way," Briam laughed. "I'm not that attached to him. No, I used a recall spell to summon him to my side when the winter wolves started pouring in." "Isn't summoning pretty mana-intensive, though?" Zorian asked. "Not if you're summoning your familiar," Briam said. "We're bound together, he and I, connected through the soul. It's a lot easier and a lot less taxing to cast certain spells where they concern him." "Huh," Zorian hummed. An hour went by, with little to show for it. Zorian listened to stories of people around him, trying to put some sense into what had transpired and thinking what he could change in the next restart to make this evacuation thing less of a fiasco. His thoughts were interrupted when a group of teachers finally stumbled into the shelters. There were 6 of them and they looked tired and frightened, much like the students who had gathered around them for explanations and assurances. The only one among them that inspired confidence in Zorian was Kirin, who remained as stoic as always. He was no longer bare-chested, opting to wear full body armor that sort of resembled the chitinous shell of a saint bug, and had a plethora of spell rods hanging off his belt in addition to the combat staff he was firmly gripping in one hand. Kirin had bad news: the attack on the academy was just one piece in an all-out invasion targeting the entire city. Zorian already knew this, of course, but everyone else was suitably shocked. The invasion was well prepared, and most of the defenders had been overpowered right at the start. The city was about to fall. Once that happened, the shelters would become just a giant death trap. They would have to go outside and fight their way out of the city before the invaders could secure everything of critical importance and turn their attention to them. People were taking it pretty badly. "Why don't you just teleport us out?" someone called. "You're supposed to be able to do that." "Academy ward control has been subverted," Kirin said calmly. "The invaders have turned our own teleportation wards against us. We can't teleport in or out." Zorian groaned. The enemy had control of the wards? How on earth did they do that? The academy wasn't just some random house with a generic warding scheme, it's supposed to be too secure and sophisticated for that. The questions continued for a minute or so before Kirin got enough of it and started to bark out orders. They needed to get moving. Zorian was paying attention to something else though. The student next to him had been acting strangely ever since Kirin and his cohort entered the shelters. Zorian could practically feel the boy's eagerness and anticipation. For what, he couldn't say, but he had a feeling it was nothing good. That is why, when the boy threw a vial full of sickly green liquid on the floor and smashed it with his foot, Zorian held his breath and fired a smasher straight into the boy's chest. Foul-smelling green smoke erupted from the broken vial, and the shelters erupted into chaos. Zorian couldn't see anything through the no doubt poisonous smoke, but the sounds of fighting were unmistakable. He stumbled through the smoke, trying to find an end to it and failing. He could tell from the hacking students around him that breathing in would be a bad idea. Thank God it didn't also irritate the eyes, or he'd never be able to cast a shield in time to stop a magic missile from smashing into his face. A circular plane of force flickered into existence in front of him, soaking the hit. The shield wavered for a second but held. And then Zorian heard Kirin shout a series of words, and all the smoke around him rushed towards the source of Kirin's voice, as if caught in some sort of vacuum. Zorian had just enough time to see Kirin holding his left hand in the air, a smoky green ball compacting itself above it, before he was forced to erect a shield again. At least he could breathe now. Thank the gods for small favors. Before the attackers, who had probably teleported in under the cover of smoke, because Zorian would remember a bunch of middle-aged men in brown robes if they had been present when he got into the shelters, could regain initiative, Kirin snapped one of his hands and a shining whip flashed through the air. The invaders promptly fell apart, the upper half of their bodies sliding off the lower half like they were never attached to one another at all. Zorian stared at Kirin in shock. He knew the retired battle mage was capable, but seeing it was something else. The man had assessed the situation within moments and solved it with a total of 2 spells. He wondered what would have happened during the initial evacuation if Kirin had been leading the students. He couldn't help but think that Kirin would have found a way to repel the initial winter wolf rush without losing anyone. Certainly the students would be more inclined to listen to Kirin than their class representatives. The man had a certain aura of command around him. "How the hell are you still standing?" wheezed Zack not far from him. Apparently he had breathed in some of the smoke, and was affected just like everyone else. Even decades-old time travelers could be brought down by some tricks, it seemed. Zorian was about to answer when the ground exploded next to him, showering him with stone fragments and knocking him on his back. He heard Kirin chanting something, but it was too late for him. The giant brown worm that emerged from the ground was far faster than it should have been, and Zorian was in too much pain to move. He saw a huge toothy maw closing around him, and then he knew only blackness. His last thoughts were that it wasn't fair. Just how many contingencies did these people have? These invaders were freaking cheaters. Chapter 010. Overlooked details. Zorian's eyes abruptly shot open as sharp pain erupted from his stomach. His whole body convulsed, buckling against the object that fell on him, and suddenly he was wide awake, not a trace of drowsiness in his mind. Good M-. No, it's not, Zorian interrupted. How could it possibly be a good morning? I got killed again. Eaten by a giant worm this time. And waking up like this is really starting to get on my nerves. Couldn't the time loop have started a day later or something? He stared at his little sister expectantly. She stared back at him, confused out of her mind and probably a little frightened. What? She asked hesitantly. Zorian wordlessly flipped her over the edge of the bed. She fell to the floor with a thud and an indignant yelp, and Zorian quickly jumped to his feet to better respond to any violence she might decide to retaliate with. Having learned his lesson during previous restarts, he immediately set out towards the bathroom before she could get her bearings. She realized what he was doing quickly, but by then he had already locked the door behind him. Her screams of outrage were music for his ears, especially since they eventually caused Mother to come after her and give her a scolding. Maybe it was a good morning, after all. Break. Trains. Zorian hadn't really liked them to start with, but he was starting to develop an intense dislike of them ever since he was caught in this time loop thing. Traveling via train on a regular basis was almost as annoying as Kiriel jumping on him at the start of every restart. He had toyed with the idea of killing time by striking a conversation with Ivory, so she'd be familiar with him when he got a job at the library, but scrapped the notion after a while. Mostly because he decided not to apply for the job in this restart. Working at the library like he had been doing was fairly time-consuming, and he had a much more promising project to work on, mastering all the shaping exercises in Ilse's book so he could woo her into taking him as her apprentice. Library magic was useful, but getting rid of Svim would be absolutely priceless. He wouldn't be present in Cyoria when the invasion came either. Not in this restart, nor in any near future one. Even if he had to reveal his secret to Zack because of it, he'd take the first train out of town on the eve of the summer festival. He knew that the smart, responsible thing to do would be to stay in the city and note what was happening, how the invasion was progressing and what could be done to stop it. He knew it, but it was too much for him. And not just because getting himself involved in that mess seemed to invariably lead to his death, either. The emotional roller coaster of the evacuation was very hard on his nerves, but that was just a symptom of the real problem. He struggled with his thoughts for a moment, trying to identify the root of the problem. Every reason he could think of felt not right. And then it clicked. It was the helplessness. Every time his thoughts strayed towards the topic of the invasion, he couldn't shake the notion that the forces arrayed against him were vastly beyond his ability to handle, and that the only reason he survived as long as he had was through sheer dumb luck. It occurred to him that the manner of his most recent death could easily be an allegory for this entire invasion. So you repelled a murderous pack of winter wolves and reached safety, helped foil a traitorous ambush, and now you think the worst is over? No, stupid, a giant worm suddenly jumps out of the ground and bites your head off. How were you supposed to fight something like that? How was he supposed to fight something like that? Maybe he shouldn't. A lot of things about the invasion seemed implausible. About as implausible as Zack becoming a super prodigy over the span of a single summer, Zorian learning all 15 shaping exercises in Ilse's book within the span of a month, or time travel being real. What if his theory of there being a third time traveler was correct, and that someone was the mastermind behind the invasion? It would explain a lot. Then again, it would also pose a lot of questions on its own, like why hadn't this hostile time traveler dealt with Zack already? The Lich had already proved it was very much possible to hurt people like Zack and Zorian, and was working for the invading forces already. Regardless, he intended to involve himself again with the invasion only after he acquired some serious magic, or after he calmed down somewhat and felt emotionally capable of facing the situation. Whichever came first. It's not like he could study the invasion in any great detail if he kept dying at the very start of it, anyway. Eventually the train arrived in Cyoria, and Zorian began his long trek towards the academy. He wasn't in a hurry this time, because he had finally found a spell to protect himself from rain in the last restart and was eager to try it. Well, he had actually found several protective spells meant to deal with rain and other adverse weather, but only one was within his ability to actually cast. That was okay, though, since the Rain Barrier spell was the one best suited for his purposes anyway. It offered the most complete protection, at the cost of being horribly draining to maintain. He could see why the mana drain would be a serious problem for people who wanted to use the spell extensively, but Zorian only needed it to last for an hour or two in an exceptionally mana-rich area of Cyoria. Also, being encased in an invisible sphere that repelled water was just plain more impressive than the more subtle, sophisticated wards. The barrier actually worked on water in general, not just raindrops, so he didn't even have to worry about stepping into puddles and soaking his footwear. Seeing water on the road part before him like in front of some kind of celestial emissary was mightily amusing. Also a bit of an ego boost, which is something he sorely needed after being so thoroughly outmatched during the invasion of the previous restart. He'd probably never use the spell after getting out of the time loop, since an umbrella was good enough for most occasions and didn't consume any mana, but finding a store that sold them along his usual route from the train station had proved surprisingly difficult. Which, now that he thought about it, suggested that he probably would use the spell from time to time, since he doubted this would be the only time in his life he'd find himself without an easily acquired umbrella. He shook his head. He really shouldn't be fantasizing about what he'd do after getting out of the time loop, since it didn't appear that would happen anytime soon. He had to concentrate on the present, and boy did that sound weird, considering his situation. Like, what was he going to do with Zach? He was sorely tempted to just admit everything to the boy and have them try to figure out this mess together. Surely 2 heads are better than 1? Impulsive he may be, but Zach couldn't have gotten as far as he did without having a good head on his shoulders. He didn't feel entirely comfortable with that idea, though. He strongly suspected there was more to Zach than it appeared, and he hated to charge in without knowing what he was getting himself into. He decided to see how Zach interacted with him in this restart before deciding. Break. Zorian. Over here. Zorian glanced towards the happy-looking Benasek waving at him like a lunatic and wondered what he should do. He didn't really want to talk to him. Benasek might be his closest friend among the student body, but he was also rather irritating at times, and it's not like he could tell Zorian something he didn't already know at this point. In the end he sighed in defeat and trudged over to the grinning boy. Time loop or no, it felt wrong to blatantly snub someone so visibly happy to see him, especially since he shared so much history with Benasek. He did find it interesting that Benasek was present in the cafeteria at this time, since that wasn't his usual behavior in the restarts Zorian experienced so far. These kind of unexplained divergences happened all the time, which was to be expected. There were at least 2 time travelers wandering around the time loop, changing things both inconsequential and crucial, but it was surprising to see a change this soon into the time loop. It had only been a day since he arrived in Syoria. Usually it took at least a week until everything went off the rails, and even then a lot of things repeated themselves. Most teachers followed some kind of a fixed teaching plan, for example, and rarely deviated from it. As far as he knew, Fortov always came looking for him for help with the purple creeper salve, even though his accident with Ibri only happened near the very end of the time loop. Which, now that he thought about it, suggested the accident wasn't so accidental after all. Kind of suspicious for an accident to be so insensitive to changes. You just got to Syoria, didn't you? Benasek prompted excitedly the moment Zorian sat down beside him. Zorian nodded hesitantly. Benasek was only ever this excited when talking about a particularly hot girl or when he got a hold of particularly juicy gossip material. Hopefully it was the latter, because there was no way Zorian would be staying otherwise. You're so not going to believe this. Benasek said excitedly. You know Zach? You know, Zach Novita, last scion of the noble house Novita? He went to class with us these last 2 years. Of course it's Zach. He really should have known. Of course I know him, Zorian said. He is very memorable. He is, blinked Benasek. He shook his head. I mean, of course he is. I kind of didn't expect you to know, though, since he's kind of a failure as a mage and you never interacted with him much. Zorian shrugged. Truth be told, it was very rare for him to forget someone's name, regardless of how often he had interacted with them or how long it had been since he last saw them. Even before the time loop, Zorian would have instantly known who Benasek was referring to. Anyway, Benasek continued, Zach escaped from his family mansion yesterday. What? Asked Zorian incredulously. What do you mean, escaped? Why would he need to escape from his own mansion? Well, that's the question, isn't it? Benasek said. Apparently he had an argument with his guardian that eventually descended into a full-blown magical duel. A duel which, get this, Zach won. Half of the mansion was trashed, and Zach fled into the city and has yet to be found. They're searching for him everywhere. Wow, Zorian said, honestly at a loss for words. What the hell was that about? You said it, Benasek agreed. I'm not sure I believe the official story, though. I mean, there's no way Zach could have taken on his guardian in a magical duel. Tezin's is a 7th circle mage or something, and Zach barely passed his own certification. Then again, something sure demolished Novita Mansion. How do you know this? Asked Zorian. It's all over the newspapers, said Benasek. Besides, everyone is talking about it. I can't believe one of our classmates would be involved in something like that. What do you think, Zorian? Ben. I honestly don't know what to think about that, said Zorian. And he really meant it. He didn't doubt for a second that Zach could beat the stuffing out of his guardian, 7th circle or not. The man was a politician, as far as Zorian knew, not a battle mage, but why would he want to do that? I suppose he won't be coming to class this time, then, mused Zorian out loud. Then again, he would not have put it past Zach to just walk into class one of these days as if nothing was wrong. I doubt it, Benasek laughed. Did he kill anyone? Asked Zorian. Benasek shook his head in the negative. So basically he didn't do anything that serious. What's the worst that can happen to him if he simply turns himself in? Well, Tezin must not be too happy with him now, and he's too influential to brush off, even for someone like Zach, said Benasek. Attacking one of the elders of Eldamar is actually a fairly serious crime, and Tezin could really ruin Zach's day if he was inclined to pursue satisfaction. Not that I think he would, since that would just draw even more attention to what happened. This whole thing is a giant political scandal for him. I'm guessing Zach will come back after a month or so, after he cools off a bit, and Tezin will magnanimously forgive him everything. Zorian was silent. Zach had told him that it was rare for him to spend a restart in Cyoria, and even rarer for him to attend classes. In light of that, it had been foolish of him to expect Zach to be around in this restart. Zach may have found Zorian interesting in the previous restart, but probably not that interesting. Still, this was more than a little strange. If he had wanted to leave and do his own thing, couldn't he have just walked out of his mansion one day and kept going? Who would have stopped him? His guardian? Why would Tezin do that? The man was clearly very hands-off in his dealings with his charge, as evidenced by Zach's frequent absences from school during the last 2 years, as well as Zach's abysmal performance prior to the time loop. There was no obvious answer, and Zorian didn't feel like trying to track down Zach. He probably couldn't find him even if he tried, and he had more attainable goals to pursue. Like getting out of Svim's merciless clutches. What could be more important than that? Break. The rest of the restart was pleasantly uneventful. There was no Zach, since the boy never showed up in school and couldn't be found by anyone. After a week or so, the newspapers stopped covering the story because there were no new developments to justify the articles, and the rumors making rounds across the student body died down soon after. For his part, Zorian threw himself completely into mastering the exercises in Ilsa's book. He neglected virtually everything else, often skipping classes when he thought he could get away with it. Akoja was furious, since he was apparently ruining the attendance record of the class, and got Ilsa to corner him one day about it. Fortunately, Zorian's ability to get top grades on every exam, despite his spotty attendance, blunted the impact of Akoja's criticism, and Zorian managed to convince Ilsa he was working on a personal project that was taking most of his time, not skipping classes for the heck of it as Akoja claimed. He assured her the project would be finished within a month, and that he would resume attending classes regularly after the summer festival. She made him promise that he would show her what he was working on when he was done, and he enthusiastically agreed with her. His single-minded focus gave results quickly. He mastered both vertical and fixed position levitation by the end of the restart. He didn't bother showing these advanced skills to Svim, who was still having him work on the pen spinning exercise, since he doubted he'd get a worthwhile reaction. Nothing seemed to please that guy. He hadn't been present in the city when the invasion came, of course. Without Zach's ring, He was even more useless in combat than he was in the last restart, so it was doubtful he could have lasted for very long in the midst of it all. He did make sure to practice with combat invocations he learned from Zack each day, hoping to hone them into the same reflexive state that Zack displayed. That would take years of practice, of course, but that just meant he'd better start as soon as possible. He also didn't just leave via train like he usually did, he traveled by foot to one of the hills overlooking the city and observed the city from there. Watching the invasion unfold from such a high vantage point was not only a lot easier on Zorian's nerves than being in the thick of it, it was also rather informative. It was interesting to see how the invasion played out in broad terms. It seemed to have several stages, the first of which was, of course, the disguised artillery magic barrage. The explosive flares mostly targeted three crucial areas: the city hall, the local military base, and one cluster of buildings that Zorian didn't recognize. The academy didn't appear to be a primary target, possibly because the invaders wanted it reasonably intact. Aside from the initial blast, the impact zone seemed to spawn scores of fire elementals that had to be dealt with. Fortunately, a lot of buildings in Cyoria were at least moderately warded against fire, because Zorian didn't doubt for a second that the entire city would have been aflame within minutes otherwise. Once the fire elementals had a few minutes to make a nuisance of themselves, monsters poured out of the sewers, and after they rampaged across the city a bit, the spellcasters finally arrived. The battle was still raging when the clock finally hit 2 past midnight and everything went suddenly black. All things considered, the army of monsters was the least destructive part of the invasion. If he could somehow prevent the initial barrage from crippling the city defense right from the start, or take out a lot of the attacking mages that followed in the monsters' wake, well, it was worth a shot when he finally got some skills under his belt. The next 3 restarts were essentially the same, right down to Zack dueling his guardian and escaping into the night. Apparently that wasn't just a one-time thing, but a rather routine occurrence. The exact details varied, but every time he roughed Tezzin up before setting off God knows where. Unfortunately, Zorian couldn't find out anything substantial about Tezzin. The man was a high-ranking politician, and thus not exactly approachable, and nothing in publicly available sources explained Zack's apparent hostility towards the man. His work with Ilsa's book progressed steadily, but he was frankly getting a bit sick of it. There was only so much of incessant shaping practice he could stand before he lost all enthusiasm. Besides, Ilsa said most students go through them at a rate of 6 per year, and he was already more effective than that, something that he attributed to his unusual focus in the matter. How many people could afford to focus all their energies on shaping exercises? There were so many things vying for the typical student's attention that shaping exercises no doubt ended up near the bottom of their priorities. That was why he was currently in Ilsa's office, trying to see if he could get something out of her without mastering quite the entire book. "What can I do for you, Mr. Kaczynski?" Ilsa asked. "Well, I'm a bit concerned about the program you outlined in your first class," said Zorian. "I'm not sure I'll get anything out of it, since I already have a solid grasp on all the topics you mentioned." Ilsa raised an eyebrow at him. "Hey, it worked on Karen, why wouldn't it work on Ilsa too?" "I see," she said after a second of silence. "Would you mind if I gave you a couple of quick tests to confirm that?" Confident he could deal with anything she tested him with, he agreed. Ilsa proceeded to rummage through her drawers and took out 2 different tests. One was an exact copy of the same test Ilsa gave to the whole class just before the summer festival, and Zorian proceeded to fill it out in 10 minutes flat by sheer memory. The other was unfairly hard, because it covered advanced topics that didn't turn up in class at all. Zorian only managed to fill out a quarter of the questions before time was up, and he was fairly sure not all of his answers were correct. Ilsa skimmed through them quickly and then nodded to herself. "Your theoretical knowledge is pretty spotty," Ilsa said with a theatrical sigh, and Zorian had to stop himself from scowling. That was such bullshit. She gave him that second test just to make sure he failed. "Here. I'll give you a list of additional reading to study in your free time. 2 minutes later Zorian found himself practically pushed out of the door, a piece of paper with hastily scribbled writing in his hand. He glared at the list of book titles, very much tempted to incinerate it on the spot. He was supposed to start on the variations of the flame-producing exercise, anyway. But he didn't. He would not be defeated that easily. If he could survive Svim's mentoring methods this long, he could definitely read a couple of theoretical manuals. He would be back. She could be sure of that. Break. Good morning, brother. Morning, morning, morning. Good morning, Kiri, said Zorian pleasantly. Thank you for waking me up. Kiriel stared at him for a couple of seconds and then huffed in disappointment at his lack of reaction and got off of him all on her own. Well damn, he should have tried that ages ago. You're no fun, she accused. Zorian simply nodded in agreement. Mom wants to talk to you, Kiriel said. Could you show me some magic before you go, though? Please? Well, why not? He quickly cast the floating lantern spell, causing an orb of light to spring into existence above his palm. He had the orb fly around the room while he repeated the spell 2 more times, producing a different colored orb each time. The books Ilsa had told him to read were mostly boring crap, but they did tell him something rather interesting. All those variations he had been practicing had more uses than just improving his shaping skills. Apparently, they also allowed him to adjust certain spells more to his liking. The same variation of the light-emitting exercise that allowed him to produce colored light also enabled him to change the color of the glowing orb produced by the floating lantern spell. Mastering a whole bunch of light-related exercises would apparently also make light-based invocations more powerful and less mana-intensive, and the same principle applied to other groups of spells as well, such as fire-related exercises improving invocations based around fire and heat, and levitation-based ones improving spells relying on telekinetic forces. He was a lot less annoyed at having to go through all those shaping exercises when he found that out. Hell, if they were that useful, he'd probably see if he could find more of them when he ran out of the ones in Ilsa's book. More. More. Kiri demanded. Distracting Kiri with a few more orbs, Zorian quietly slipped out of the room and went to the bathroom before Kiri could realize what was happening. Why was she always so intent on getting there first anyway? That was horribly petty, even for Kiriel. He'd have to ask her in one of the restarts. Unfortunately, he sort of forgot he filled his entire room with multicolored orbs of light by the time Ilsa came around to visit, so he thought nothing about inviting her into his room. He hastily swept his hand in front of him, casing them all to wink out of existence, but it was too late. Isla had already seen them and was looking at him curiously. That's not really a second-year spell, Ilsa remarked, her eyes boring into his own. Daimen can be a pretty good teacher when he wants to be, said Zorian with a cheeky smile, shamelessly relying on Daimen's fame to deflect any concerns. Teaching first circle spells like that one to uncertified mages was illegal, but if Zorian ever learned something in his life, it was that Daimen can get away with anything. And you know how to produce something other than white light, Ilsa noted. Impressive. I guess this should be easy for you, then. She handed him a very familiar scroll, and Zorian was just about to flood it with mana to break the seal when he realized something was wrong. Ilsa was studying him like a hawk, expectant and alert. She had never shown this much interest in his scroll opening before, so what made this one special? He stared at the scroll for a couple of seconds, unable to see any difference from the scroll he was used to. Even the symbols on the seal were the same. Wait. A few moments later he remembered where he saw the symbols inscribed on the seal and promptly felt like banging his head against the wall or something. Why, those sneaky little... He had been doing it wrong. All this time he had been simply pouring mana into the seal to break it, when instead he had to channel mana into it in very specific ways so he could peel it off intact. It said so, right at the goddamn seal. It required more mana control than simply flooding the seal with mana, but it was nothing he hadn't already been capable of, even before the time loop. All this time he had thought the symbols on the seal were purely ornamental in nature, but no, they were instructions. Instructions written in a somewhat obscure form, but still. How could he have missed that? He directed his mana to flow along the sides of the seal, causing it to pop off without resistance. Well done, Ilsa said with a smile. Not many students have such a firm grasp on their magic at this stage. I see someone is continuing in Damon's footsteps. Zorian smiled back politely. He mustn't scowl, he mustn't scowl. Unfortunately, I'm in a bit of a hurry, so we'll have to continue this conversation later, Ilsa said. Visit me in my office when you get to Syoria. Now about your electives. Break. Ilsa stared at him. He stared back. She glanced towards the two completely filled-out tests on her desk and then returned her gaze towards him, this time with a speculative look. Zorian remained silent. It actually felt good to baffle someone like this, Zorian decided. Apparently Ilsa wasn't as cold-blooded about improbable skills as Svim was. I must admit, I didn't quite expect this level of knowledge and shaping skill when I told you to come and see me, Ilsa said thoughtfully. That second exam I gave you is the one I give to students at the end of their third year, and you only got 2 of the questions wrong. On top of that, you know 10 different variations of the basic 3, which is astronomical for a third-year student. She tapped her pen against the table, lost in thought. You may be a bit too advanced for what I intend to teach your group this year, Ilsa finally admitted. My class is mostly there to make sure the students don't have any obvious holes in their shaping skills and theoretical knowledge, and to teach them a few miscellaneous spells that are of general utility to most mages. You're way beyond that. What am I going to do with you? Transfer me away from Svim so you could teach such a promising student? Zorian tried. She laughed at him. Sorry, she said. You're good, but not that good. Besides, you should have it easier than most of Svim's 6 charges. What with your amazing shaping skills and all. You'd be surprised how little difference that makes to him, Zorian sighed. Oh come on, Mr. Kaczynski, you didn't even have a single session with him, Ilsa chided. I'm sure that whatever rumors you heard were greatly exaggerated. Right, said Zorian, unable to keep himself from rolling his eyes. Can you at least give me a written permit to skip your lectures? You said yourself I have nothing to learn there, anyway. That wasn't quite what Zorian was after, but he supposed it was better than nothing. It would give him a bunch of free periods throughout the week, which wasn't terribly useful while he was inside the time loop, where he could just skip classes if he needed more free time, but would come in handy when and if he got out of it. And besides, a written permit would cut down on Akoja's whining, if nothing else. No, Ilsa said. I need you in class, if only to motivate the rest of your classmates to try harder. Don't worry, I'll make sure you're not bored during class. Crap. Maybe he shouldn't have asked her that. In the meantime, I'm going to do you a favor, Ilsa continued. While I am personally too busy to teach you, I will see if I can find a teacher willing to give you some private instruction. Do you have an area of magic you're particularly interested in? Personally, I would recommend you look into either divination or alteration, but it's your choice. Spell formulas, Zorian said firmly. Oh. Ambitious, noted Ilsa. It's a hard subject. Not something your shaping skills can help you with either. I'm certain, Zorian confirmed. Spell formulas had fascinated him ever since he started to learn magic, so there was no way he was wasting this kind of opportunity. Very well, Ilsa shrugged. I don't foresee any problems in that case. I'm sure Miss Boole will be ecstatic to have such a talented and determined student. Miss Boole? As in, Nora Boole, the orange-haired maniac that expected them to read 12 books within a week and gave them 60-question progress tests every other lecture? Zorian resisted the urge to sigh. Why couldn't he have a normal mentor for once?